When Jesus tested the poor boy who found $5,000, what happened next will astound you. The city breathed like a living thing, a tangle of brakes and engines, a river of umbrellas in briefcases, neon signs blinking their impatience against a gray afternoon. At one intersection, where the curb met the hum of traffic lights, a small figure stood with a cardboard box balanced on his knees. He had a row of candies tucked into neat lines, a few crumpled bills in a tin, and shoes that had known better days. His name was Tomas, though most people called him kid or boy without learning anything more. He watched the light change, held up a candy, smiled a practiced smile, and counted the slow, steady minutes that separated one day from the next paycheck of hope. Across from him, the city moved on. A woman in heels scrolled through a phone with one gloved hand. A man in a suit hunched into his collar against the wind. A taxi driver yawned and nodded at the stop. The world offered its regular noises, horns like distant beehives, the scrape of a bus against the curb, a radio's muffled top 40. But for Tomas there was another rhythm, one he felt in his chest every time he thought of home, the hollow echo of the cupboards, the memory of his mother smoothing the last empty plate and forcing a smile toward the bathtub light. He had not been born into want by choice. There were bills that looked like mountains folded into envelopes at the kitchen table, a school with eyes looking for tuition, a cough his mother tried to hide. Some nights they ate little, some mornings they woke up with less than the day before. Tomas sold candy because he did stand at the light and make people look away without needing anyone to speak his name. It paid enough for a loaf sometimes, a bus fare, a pencil. It was not a life he dreamed of, it was the life he had, and he learned to move through it like water moves through pebbles, patient, unobtrusive, steady. That afternoon, something caught his shoe by the gutter, a pale sliver of paper tucked under a wrapper, almost invisible, like a secret not meant to be found. He bent, fingers closing over the edge, and pulled up a heavy envelope. There was no stamp, no name, nothing at first but the faint smell of cologne and the sharp metallic creak of money within. His heart gave a little stutter. He eased a corner open with the edge of a coin and let the bills fan out into the sun. $5,000. For a moment the city stopped being a mass of indifferent faces and became a pulse at the end of his hands. He imagined the small things first, his mother's favorite tea on the shelf, a bag that would finally fit both their groceries, a pair of shoes that wouldn't leak when it rained. He let his mind run faster than his hope. The heating bill, the overdue notices stacked in a drawer, the school fees with their quiet deadlines. He tasted a future where someone else carried the weight for a week.
And then a different feeling tugged at him, lighter than fear, heavier than curiosity. It was not a voice he heard with his ears. It was a presence that made the hair at the back of his neck stand up, a soft insistence in the place where conscience lives. He remembered his mother's hands, the care in the way she wrapped plastic around the bread. He remembered the knock on the window, the way she would ask, "Did you eat?" and smile even when she had not. The envelope sat in his lap, its edges pressed like a promise and sharp like a question. What would you do if you were him? The thought scolded and unsettled in equal measure. He crouched on the curb, the traffic lights pulsing red and green above him, and looked up and down the street as if the owner might be leaning out of a car window, frantic. He tucked the bills back in with a careful, trembling hand, and rose, his decision forming like dew on glass. He would find the owner. It seemed right to him, not heroic, simply necessary. He knew the danger of keeping something that wasn't his. He had been taught that the hardest choices are often the simplest ones, the ones we make when no one is watching. Before he could move further, a voice cut across the intersection. A man in an impeccably cut coat halted at the edge of the curb, phone in hand, eyes narrowed like someone who measured everything. He looked at Tomas with a quick scowl, assessed the thinness of the boy and the neatness of the coat in a single sweep. "Did you take my envelope?" he asked, the words flat and sharp. Tomas held the envelope tightly against his chest, palms pressing into cardboard. "I found it on the curb," he said. He had practiced phrases like this, ones that refused to crumple under pressure. He answered simply, honestly. Honesty was a quiet thing in his mouth. It tasted of copper and the faint sour, too little food. The man's face twisted in impatience. "You should move," the man snapped. "There are cars. Where did you even get that?" His hand brushed toward the envelope, and Tomas felt the need to pull back, as if someone might take the air from his lungs. The crowd edged closer with the magnetism of a small scene. A woman on the corner snapped a selfie without looking away. Someone laughed, someone tooted. The millionaire, if the suit and the car meant anything, spoke again, louder, his rich voice filling the space. "You have no idea what this is worth. Get away from me." Humiliation is not loud. It does not explode like glass. It settles in a slow, cold way, like rain soaking through your jacket from the inside. Tomas's cheeks burned. He would have explained this was not his, but the man's impatience turned magic into accusation. The owner took the envelope, flipped it once, and the bills inside slipped back into the fold like a secret retracted.
Without a word of thanks, he walked away, briefcase swinging, every step a message that the city belonged to those with space to make waves, and those without were meant to absorb them. Tomas stood with what felt like the weight of the whole day in his hands. Around him, people returned to their business as if nothing had happened. The light changed. The world moved on. He could have clung to the memory of the money and the pulse of possibility it offered. He could have ducked into an alley and let the bills solve the emptiness at home. He thought of his mother's laugh, how she pressed the back of her fingers to her mouth when she smiled to hide the pinch of worry. He thought of the way a right action, even when unnoticed, sometimes feels like a quiet enough miracle. He folded the empty envelope and tucked it into his pocket. He sat back down and opened his box of candy with hands that had been doing this since he could remember. He offered a single sweet to the next passerby, and whose fingers closed over his. Life resumed its rhythm. The city's noises swelled back in around him, a siren, a shout, the rumble of the subway beneath the asphalt. Tomas counted the minutes as if counting prayers. If this story is speaking to you so far, if the way small choices can reshape lives matters, take a moment and subscribe so more people can hear stories that remind us what honesty looks like in the quiet. He did not know as he sat that eyes had been watching, the kind that do not rely on cameras or applause. The day leaned toward evening. The sun, which had been a hard strip across windshields, started to soften. People crossed the street in a blur of coats and scarves. Tomas tucked a few coins into a tin and thought of buying a loaf. He thought of his mother's tired face and the list of things that did not have to be fixed by money alone, but seemed easier with the burden eased. Someone left another envelope nearby, without the urgency that comes from flattery. It rested by the curb like a folded apology. When Tomas looked down, his hands moved before any thought. He slid the flap and found a note and more bills. $25,000 pressed flat and still, like something waiting for permission to breathe. The note was brief, as notes that change things often are. The handwriting was deliberate, not rushed, and the words were simple. Honesty finds its way back. You were seen. The first feeling that rushed through Tomas was shock. A cold, incredulous shock, like stepping into a pool at dawn. His fingers trembled. He sat very still, the city's roar reduced to a distant ocean. The money in his hands felt foreign and dangerous in equal turns. For a second, he allowed himself to dream in full color. The bills paid, the teacher's fees paid in full, a warm dinner that lasted more than one night, a possibility of school books and time to learn again.
But beneath those quick, bright images was something more profound, a deep, unnameable peace that washed over him. It was as if someone had tapped his shoulder and said, "You did right. We noticed." He did not tear open the note to demand who had left it. He read it as if it were a prayer, short, clear, and absolute. The money was an answer, but not the kind he would have written for himself. It felt like an acknowledgement, like a hand being placed over his shoulder in a crowded room and not letting him be invisible. Around the same time, the man whose envelope Tomas had first found sat in the front of his car, the city's glass turning to motion in his windows. He had been angry when he lost the money, more at the inconvenience than at the loss itself, but as the day folded into evening, something more complicated unspooled inside him. The memory of the boy's face, honest and small, pricked him. The way Tomas had held his shoulders, the steadiness in his voice, even when accused, lingered like an ember. Later, in a quiet room with a view of rooftops and lights, the man found he could not refold the memory into indifference. In the space between one task and another, his conscience, thin at times, brittle in others, began to stir. He had everything people measure and admire, A house with clean geometric lines, a calendar full of meetings, a column of zeros in his bank statement. But that evening, when he found himself alone with the noise of his own thoughts, the shiny little world he had constructed seemed less like a fortress and more like a set. He replayed the moment at the curb as if it were a small film he could not stop. He heard in the silence that followed his own words, sharp as a shard, "Get away from me." The phrase did not sound like the man he wanted to be when his life was measured at the end. Guilt is a quiet visitor in some hearts, and in his it arrived as a series of small, nagging acts: a brewed coffee left to cool, a book opened and not read, a friend left a voicemail unheard. He could have filed the memory away, purchased a small distraction, written the night off. Instead, he stood at his mirror and traced the creases that years had drawn at the corner of his mouth, and wondered when the edges of his life had grown so sharp they cut others. The next day, he woke feeling lighter and more awkward than he had expected. He drove, not to a lawyer, not to a shop he did not frequent, but back to the intersection where the boy sold candy. He parked the car where the glass reflected the sky, took a breath that tasted like apology, and waited. When Tomas recognized him, it was like seeing a different planet, someone finally too aware to look away. The man's hands were not smooth anymore. They shook a quarter inch when extended in apology. "I'm sorry," he said. The words fell like a stone that made a small, honest splash. The apology was not a public announcement.
It was low and private, as if he were repaying a debt he had held in silence. Tomas looked at him, steady and cautious. There was no showmanship, no camera, only two people on a curb, measuring when regret crosses into action. The rich man stepped forward with a food basket, a careful offering of cooked things and fresh fruit, an envelope tucked in with a formal note this time. No large sums flashed like prizes, but practical help, an offer to clear a few of the pressing debts, money for school, an introduction that might lead to work that did not depend on the stoplight and a box of candy. He spoke of error and of learning. He listened when Tomas said he had acted because it was right, not out of despair for reward. That exchange, the apology and the handing over of help, was not a one-time spectacle. It was the beginning of a small, private reformation. The millionaire learned how to be less impressed with his own status and more attentive to faces in the flow of the city. He volunteered in small ways that did not make headlines, paying a month's rent for a neighbor who had fallen behind, leaving a regular gift at a shelter anonymously, making sure his company offered positions that trained young people. He did not publish his transformation. He quietly rearranged his life so that his resources made room for other people. Back at home, the unfolding was tender and modest. Tomas brought the notes and the envelopes to his mother like a priest bringing a blessing. She did not leap or clap. She put her hand over her mouth and sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the room lit by the soft glimmer of lamplight. The bills were unfolded and paid. The cough that had been ignored for so long could now be met with a doctor's appointment rather than whispered remedies. There was food on the table that night, a hot stew with bread, and the way she ate was like a woman getting to know herself again. They did not parade the money through the neighborhood. They used it as hands use a tool, to mend, to steady, to make ordinary life possible. Tomas returned to school not because a windfall had made it easy, but because someone had opened a small, steady path. He learned to sit in a classroom without the constant attention of survival tugging at him. He read books and learned that the world contained phrases of art and music and algebra that were not a currency, but a way to think. The change in him was visible in small ways: a backpack with straps that did not cut into his shoulders, a note from a teacher praising a careful piece of homework, the way he stopped offering a candy to a stranger when he saw a different hunger in their eyes. The man who had once been brusque discovered the unremarkable power of humility. He found that kindness, when practiced in private, trained him to notice the boy on the curb without impatience. He started listening to people he did not expect to hear, and in that listening, learned that his world had been narrower than he imagined.
His change did not erase the flaws of his past. No one's life turns immaculate overnight, but it reoriented him toward restitution and away from the small cruelties that pass for convenience. There was a second kind of restoration that mattered just as much as groceries and bills: dignity. The mother, who had always wrapped her worries in a smile, stopped painting over the edges between what she needed and what she had. People in her neighborhood, once passing by with indifferent shoulders, began to offer smiles that carried recognition. The boy who sold candy was no longer merely background in the city's film. He had become a neighbor with a name, a student with homework, a son whose choices had a geometry of consequence. All of this could have been told as a simple tale. A boy found money, a man repented, they were helped. But what makes it remarkable is the way unseen things pressed in. how conscience whispers, how integrity shapes the shape of a day, how the presence of something beyond immediate sight can turn on a light in ordinary places. The story's astonishment is not only the stack of currency folded in neat bundles, it is that the inner life of two people shifted. The boy's fidelity to what was right and the man's willingness to admit error set in motion practical help, and more quietly, an altered way of seeing. There is a tension here worth pausing on. It would be dangerous to claim this as a formula. Integrity is not a bargaining chip in a ledger with guaranteed returns. You cannot say, "Be honest and you will receive money." That would be a faith reduced to a vending machine. This episode is an instance of providence, an answer that arrived through human hands, through a conscience that was stirred, through choices that aligned with compassion. It is both particular and exemplar, a reminder that choices made in secret do not disappear into the dark, they ripple. Imagine for a moment the small theater of conscience inside each person. Many scenes play in that space, vanities, compromises, moments of courage. We like to think of tests as public trials with judges and witnesses, but most moral decisions are private, taken in the tiny rooms of heart and mind. Tomas did not ask for a crown when he chose to find the owner. He did not expect a reward. He acted because the other way would have been a quiet theft from the vocabulary of who he wanted to be. That's the part of the story that should startle us, how an unseen, reverent presence, call it grace, call it conscience, call it the God who sees, can transform the ordinary and sequester justice into places where the world seems indifferent. A note in an envelope can say a lot. Honesty finds its way back. You were seen. Those words, brief and unadorned, threaded through the boy's life like a needle through cloth, sewing a seam of certainty where doubt had been thick. For the millionaire, the note and the memory of the curb were two mirrors reflecting a life he could still change.
For the mother, the envelopes were a practical opening, an easing of urgent things. But moral imagination also asks of us something harder. When you are the one in the city with the power to help, will you? When you watch someone on the corner and the temptation to look away is easy, will your conscience prick? When you have influence, will you use it to restore dignity rather than to keep others small? The rich man in this story did not become holy overnight. He simply allowed himself to be corrected and to act on that correction. His transformation was private and practical, humbly administering aid where it was needed, without fanfare. There is a quiet mathematics to restoration that goes beyond sums. Paying a bill does not cure memory, it clarifies living. Clearing a tuition fee does not guarantee a future, but it opens a seat at a table once closed. The envelopes in this story were not a magic carpet. They were steps. They were ways to allow a life to breathe more fully, to grant a child room to learn, a mother space to recover, a man the chance to be different. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed in small ways. The corner where Tomas stood became less invisible. People began to nod, to remember his name, to buy a candy not out of pity, but out of respect for his persistence. The millionaire at the end of a workday would sometimes stop by a community center and leave an envelope quietly at a desk for someone to use. Other times he would sit with a young apprentice from a city program to show how a business conversation might be kind. His life was still busy, still full of meetings, but the axis had shifted, tilted toward responsibility. It would be easy to make the moral tidy and move on, but the point of this story is less about the money and more about the unspectacular dignity of someone choosing right and the way that choice can awaken compassion in another person. We're invited to see that grace often travels along human channels, a hand reaching into a pocket, an apology offered, a check cut, a seat in a classroom paid for. Providence in this telling respects human agencies and calls them to be instruments of repair. At the end of the day, Tomas and the millionaire held different currencies. One had regained a future, the other had acquired a quieter conscience. Both received something they did not have, and both were asked to steward it. The mother, who folded her hands and cried at the simple goodness of hot soup on the table, taught them both how small, restored things make a world of difference. So where does this leave the rest of us? Perhaps with a question that sits toward the end of every honest life.
What do you do when no one is watching? Will your small, private decisions mirror who you say you are when the cameras are off? Are you ready to be the kind of person whose conscience leads to action, whose resources become tools of restoration, and who notices those the city prefers to forget?
If this story moves you, if it wakes something in you that wants to respond, consider sharing it with someone else. Talk about it. Let it be a mirror and a map. Tell us below, what would you do if no one were watching? There is a final image worth holding. Tomas closing his schoolbook at dusk, his backpack slung across his shoulder, the lamp in his kitchen glowing as steady, ordinary light. The millionaire walked past a window and paused, seeing a boy in a doorway laugh at something his mother said. He slowed, and in that slow moment, he understood that the city had more corners to mend than a single curb. He bought no glory for himself. He found a rhythm to live in that included giving without notice. The envelopes had done their work. They had moved money and shifted hearts. Stories like this are not lessons packaged to sell a simple theology. They are invitations to examine how we live when the ledger of the world cannot observe us, to notice that truth is sometimes rewarded in ways we do not expect, to let conscience be a guide that shapes action. If honesty is the seed, then mercy and restitution are the soil that allow it to grow. The quiet miracle is that ordinary people, whether a boy in worn shoes or a man in a fine coat, can be instruments of that growth. So the next time you find an envelope, literal or metaphorical, at your feet, something tempting that calls for an easy choice, remember Tomas sitting on the curb, the weight of possibility in his hands, the sense that something invisible was watching. Choose in a way that will make you proud when the day is done. Choose so that if there is a presence that notices the small things, you will find peace. This is what happened when Jesus, in the way God so often does, through conscience, through the nudging of the heart, tested a poor boy who found $5,000. The astonishment was not merely in the second envelope or the stack of bills. It was in how two lives were quietly repaired, how dignity was restored, and how a private decision echoed outward to change more than just one household. What would you do when no one's watching?